I'm used to lifting the mic every time I come up to the podium. Thank you so much. It's so nice to be here, and it's really great to see all of you out to talk about archaeology. That's always exciting for an archaeologist. So I want to start by introducing the forgotten coast of my title. Thank you very much. I know that you have a lot of people here who are experienced in Florida archaeology, and I've learned quite a bit about that, for instance, at dinner today. But I'm going to talk about the other ocean, the other one that some of us don't get to visit very often. I do, fortunately. The Mar del Sur of my title is the Pacific Ocean. When the Spanish first arrived in the Western Hemisphere, they were obviously coming across the Atlantic. And when they encountered the mainland of the Americas, it was on the very large isthmus that runs between continental North America and continental South America. And to get to the Pacific Ocean, they generally went due south, across Panama first, and then later south across Mexico. So when they first encountered the Pacific, they called it the Mar del Sur, or the Sea of the South. And that's the sea of my title. The Sea of the South, the Mar del Sur, was a really important area for long-distance exchange for the Spanish, and we have some evidence that it was important for long-distance exchange for ancient peoples. However, let me start here. In Mesoamerica, our evidence for exchange is largely based on the Yucatan Peninsula. Where's my... Okay, let's see if I can point. No. What do I press? Okay, anyways, Mesoamerica and the Yucatan Peninsula is that stuff on the far right. How about that? Over there. So I want to talk about the Pacific coast of Mesoamerica, which is going to be, well, the mouse pointer's pointing right to it. Okay. In 1522, Pedro de Alvarado, one of the conquistadores who had arrived with Cortez, left Mexico City, which is sort of under the S of Mesoamerica, and he headed south to the city of Tututepec. Tututepec was the capital of what some archaeologists and historians call a mini empire. And we call it that because it was independent from the Aztecs. It was not paying tribute, it had never been conquered, and in fact was engaged in battles at various points on its borders with the Aztec Empire. Why did de Alvarado go there? It was literally the first place the conquistadores went after they had secured control of Mexico City and the Aztec Empire. Well, they went there because it's a wealthy area. The rulers of Tututepec were known throughout Mesoamerica for their affluence. And obviously, the Spanish were not in Mexico for charitable purposes, right? Let's talk about what sorts of resources and wealth the Tututepec rulers would have had access to. Because these are the kinds of resources that anyone living on the Pacific coast of Mesoamerica would have had access to. Obviously, right there on the ocean and in the estuaries, you're going to have marine shell that were used for a variety of purposes, including musical instruments, for jewelry, fish, which could be dried and brought inland, although there is some question as to whether the technology existed to move fish any great distance in the pre-Columbian era. Salt, which is of course necessary for human survival and was very important. Salt works were in fact a really important resource, and we know that the lords of Tututepec, the rulers, owned salt works in the areas along the coast. And then feathers. Feathers were a really important part of costume, and especially the very wealthy wore these fabulous feathered outfits with big headdresses and fans of feathers coming off the back of their clothing. They probably weren't using brown pelican feathers, but I happened to be in the estuaries on a day when there were a lot of brown pelicans about and not a lot of roseate spoonbills. So we get a brown pelican picture in the slide. But a number of beautiful colored birds live specifically in the Pacific tropics of Mesoamerica. Come a little bit inland, and the coastal valleys, again, these are tropical and subtropical environments in the Mar del Sur of Mesoamerica. You have cacao, better known as chocolate, right? Everybody's favorite resource. and very, very valuable in the Western Hemisphere. In fact, cacao beans were used in certain places as a kind of fungible wealth, basically as money. We also have cotton growing in this part of the world. It grew in other areas, including the Yucatan Peninsula, but cotton is what you wore because, you know what, it's hot in Mexico, so you're not going to want to wear things like leather, for instance. Feathers, again, and honey. Also, a lot of beekeeping in this part of the world. You come inland, and on the coastal river valleys, you have fish again, stone. Stone doesn't sound very exciting, right, to us today, but of course, if you want to cut anything in the pre-Columbian world, you need rocks to do it. And then perhaps, in some cases, metals. There is some evidence that the Pacific coastal rivers of Mesoamerica, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, some of them actually carried gold dust. And so we find at Pacific coastal sites, especially later in time, things like this. These are called copper axe monies. These are found particularly on the west coast of Oaxaca, where I do my research. I found these with some students. We were just walking around a recently plowed area that was going to become a papaya field. And we found 3 of these things sitting on the surface. The one on the bottom with the mouse pointer on it is unfortunately badly burned because they had burned the field. They would originally, of course, have been a bright coppery color. These also are a form of fungible wealth. They would be broken, and which is why you see that one that's sort of got a pretty clean break. That may have been intentional. You break them up and, again, use them as a kind of currency. And then, of course, gold, right? This is actually from a tomb in Oaxaca. And the rulers of the Mixtec Empire, the Mixtec were the ethnic group that controlled the Tututepec Empire, were known for making very beautiful gold artifacts. And this is one of many, many pieces from a very famous tomb at the archaeological site of Monte Alban in the valley of Oaxaca. It's actually tiny. It's only like that big. I didn't have a good scale. But that gives you an idea of the absolute beauty and the detail of the work. I mean, this is really gorgeous stuff. So you can imagine why Pedro de Alvarado might want to visit this part of the world after control of the Aztec Empire had been secured. Once the Spanish took control of all of Mexico, and they did so very quickly. You have Mexico City, Tenochtitlan there in the far upper left of your screen. And you have the southern coast of Mexico there at the bottom of the screen. Once the Spanish had gained control of most of this territory, which they had done within 10 years of their arrival, and they arrived on the mainland in 1519, they immediately set up a system to move the wealth of the Americas systematically from Mexico and other parts of the Americas across the Atlantic back to Spain. That system entailed developing ports where Spanish galleons could pull in. And of course, Spanish galleons are very different from pre-Columbian boats, as I will talk about, having a deep draft and requiring deep harbors. So what the Spanish did is they set up ports near the coastal areas that they had strong control of. The closest good port near Tututepec was Huatulco, which was a pre-Columbian port as well. The port of Huatulco, by 1540, had galleons coming in from farther to the south, down where the Google logo is over there, where most of the chocolate or the cacao was grown in the Western Hemisphere. And in fact, you had a very strong north-south cacao trade coming up the coast, going to Huatulco, up to Mexico City, and then over to Veracruz and across the Atlantic. By about 1570, the Acapulco-Manila trade, which was part of the spice trade, also a very important international trade route this time, was set up. And Huatulco slowly fades out of importance. And all of the trade coming up from Peru, coming up the coast from Guatemala, where the cacao is being grown, and today, for instance, where your coffee comes from in many cases, it heads into Acapulco, goes inland, and then across to Veracruz and across the Atlantic. What happens then is that a region that had been the center of an empire becomes a secondary depot of the Spanish Empire, and then becomes a sleepy coastal area with no development. And by the year 1600, there's no major trade going on the southern part of Mexico, on the southern coast. All of the trade, almost entirely, is focused on Acapulco. What that results in is an area of Mexico that's still underdeveloped. There's not a lot of oil down there. The fisheries are good, but the ports, again, aren't great because there aren't a lot of deep ports to allow big boats in. And it kind of fades out of history, and it becomes forgotten. And I want to talk about what happens. Oh, sorry, here's my cacao pod. There we go. What happens to, or what happened to the exchange and movement of ideas and people along this southern coast of Mexico and into Guatemala, but the Mar del Sur? So that leads me to my question. How was trade organized in Pacific Mesoamerica prior to Spanish contact? Today, not a lot of trade going on in this part of the world. By 1600, very little trade other than Acapulco is going on. What happened between Acapulco, for you guys, and Guatemala prior to Spanish rearrangement of trade systems designed to meet Spanish needs, Spanish goals, and Spanish technologies? I want to do this by talking about 3 topics. I'm going to start with the geography of Pacific Mesoamerica, because if you want to understand how people are moving around, you have to understand what they're trying to move through and around. I then want to talk about pre-Columbian technologies, what was available for pre-Columbian peoples to move around this part of the world. And then I want to talk about what we do know about pre-Columbian trade routes, because there is some evidence, and I hopefully will convince you of this, that pre-Columbian trade routes were actually, in some cases, quite different than the ones that the Spanish first encountered in the 1500s, and certainly that developed subsequently. So when we talk about the geography of this part of the world, we're talking about something really different from Florida. So I don't want to get everyone comfortable. I'm so used to teaching classes, I want people to like raise their hands and tell me how many people have been to Mexico, but that's okay, I'll hold that question for later. Let's start with a general observation. You can't talk about Mesoamerica without talking about the ocean. And I want to say Mesoamerican archaeologists do this all the time, because all the big populations, when the Spanish arrived, and even prior to Spanish arrival, were inland. They were in the middle. Mexico City is right smack dab in the geographic center of the country. Some of the other early, really big cities in Mesoamerica were in the mountainous zones of Oaxaca. Okay, I'm going to try to use a pointer here. Woohoo! Oh, look at that, look at that. So big cities here, and then, of course, all the big cities in the Maya area. Everyone's heard of those cities, right? So a lot of the big cities are inland. So when Mesoamerican archaeologists talk about Mesoamerica, they tend to talk about the land. The problem is, look at that picture. See all the blue? There's a lot of blue. One of the basic characteristics of Mesoamerica is a very disproportionate amount of water to land. There's a lot of ocean and not a lot of land. In fact, if you look at the ratio of land mass to coastline for the country of Mexico, it is double that of the United States, even when you include Canada and Hawaii, or Alaska and Hawaii, okay? So proportionally, obviously, Mexico has far less total linear coastline because the United States is a much bigger country. But when you do it as a proportion, it's all water here. So why don't we talk about it as archaeologists? Certainly, there are a lot of folks who've talked about the Yucatan, and I'm going to mention that a little bit. But pretty much nobody talks about any of this coast over here. In fact, I can't find any written accounts, except for one, that talk about canoe trade down here. So we've got all this land, or all this water, just a little bit of land, and presumably that's going to be important. The next thing I want to talk about, and let's see, I'm getting pretty good with this thing. Oh, look at that. Woohoo. Okay. Let's talk about the geography a little bit. and the geology. Let's start with our subduction zone. Pacific Mesoamerica is tectonically active. It is where the Cocos Plate, which is the plate sitting out in the Pacific Ocean, meets and starts sinking underneath the North American plate. So what that means is that you have a big ocean plate coming in, hitting land, and going under and folding the land up like that. That is going to create, well, it's going to create volcanoes. It's going to create earthquakes. And it also is going to create mountains. We hit elevations of 1,000 meters. Okay, so those are solid-sized mountains. Those, for instance, there are probably, I don't know, what is that, the 300-meter topo? That's probably like 300 meters. So imagine something triple the size of that within 20 kilometers of shore, which means that there's not a lot of flat land on the Pacific coast of Mesoamerica. And this is, in fact, characteristic of the entire Western Hemisphere. The entire west side of the Americas is mountains, which is why Seattle's such a beautiful city, why LA has such bad air quality, why, and it goes on and on and on, right? You can go the whole way down. You got all the volcanoes in Guatemala, and then you go down into Peru. It's the same thing down there, right? A little bit of land, big mountains very quickly. In fact, in Mexico, you have in that tiny little patch of land elevations reaching 5,700 meters. Okay, that's really, really high. Permanent snow. These are the volcanoes of Pico de Orizaba, Itzi and Popo, and they're all right in the center of the country. But saying it's in the center of the country isn't saying much because the country is really skinny, so they're very close to the ocean as well. So what we end up with, because of this subduction, is we have big mountains right next to the sea, big mountains inland, and in fact, if you crumpled up a piece of paper and stuck it on a flat surface, you'd kind of have a good topographic map of Mexico, okay? It's all up and down, not a lot of flat land. The other end result of this is that on the Pacific side of Mexico, you get these short, steep rivers. Not a lot of navigable waterways going from the sea inland. You can go a little ways, but not very far. And this is also characteristic of the entire western side of the Western Hemisphere, going the whole way up from Seattle and north, all the way down to Tierra del Fuego. In addition, in Pacific Mesoamerica, which this is not something that's a problem in California, is you have this really narrow isthmus. This is the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. It's one of the narrowest places in the hemisphere, and in fact was one of the big candidates when the US government was looking to build a canal. They ended up building the canal down in Panama, but this is in fact as good a location, and some people would argue better, for a variety of reasons, despite the fact that it's wider. There are no major mountains in this little patch of land. And so what you get are strong offshore winds coming the whole way across the isthmus, south, into the Pacific Ocean. Those winds are so strong that they create eddies in the ocean. Big, circular, cyclonic, for those of you who are interested in eddies, cyclonic and anticyclonic eddies in the Gulf of Tehuantepec, this little indent, right? I'm not going to move my mouse pointer, but over here. Okay. Finally, just to the left of that area, you can see those little indents, right? See the little estuaries? They look little on the map. They're huge estuaries, the size of the Tampa Bay embayment, for instance. And there are a whole series of very nice estuaries caused by the rapid movement. These short rivers are steep, right? They're coming off of mountains. They bring all this dirt, eroding from the mountainsides, down to the water, carried by the longshore currents, across the coast, creating barrier islands and estuaries. So you have fantastic estuaries all up and down this coast, going all the way up to Ixtapa and Zihuatanejo, those great beach resorts that everyone's heard of, and all the way down here to the state of Chiapas, which is what we're looking at in this slide. All right, so what does that mean? It means a couple of things if you want to do any kind of moving around Mesoamerica. And you didn't know you were going to get a geology lesson today either, did you? First of all, it's a lot easier in Mesoamerica to go east-west, sort of following, maybe northwest, southeast, to be perfectly technical, right? It's really easy to follow the long axis of the land than it is to go from the water into the highlands. That's a much harder kind of travel to do, particularly on the Pacific side because of those steep mountains. West of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, you'll notice where that I have the word subduction zone, notice how short that continental shelf is. In some places, it's 10 kilometers, and then it's a precipitous drop into the Mesoamerican Trench, which reaches 4,500 meters in depth. Okay, so it's like you're going along the continental shelf and then great deep canyon in the ocean, which makes for big swells and strong currents. We have estuary systems that are going to provide us some protection, though, from those big swells and strong currents. However, since we don't have any navigable rivers, except for one, which is kind of up in Guerrero, I'm not going to worry about that one, you can't really go very far by canoe or any other form of boat inland. You're going to have to walk. Overall, the coast itself makes a good transportation corridor. But if you want to get anything from the coast inland, it's going to get complicated. And of course, most of those coastal goods become really valuable when they're away from the coast. Okay, so this poses a problem, right? So let's talk about how we get those coastal goods away from the coast. This leads us to our transportation technologies. Mesoamerica was one of the most densely populated places in the Western Hemisphere when the Spanish arrived. Mexico City, Tenochtitlan at the time, was probably the third largest city in the world when the Spanish arrived. Certainly the only city in Europe that was close to the size of Tenochtitlan was Paris. Certainly there was nothing in Spain. And then probably there was a city in China, somewhere in Asia, that was as big, or maybe in India. That means that there were a lot of people and they needed stuff, okay? Mesoamerican peoples were incredibly creative in solving the problems that they had moving their stuff around. However, they still had limits. First of all, beasts of burden are right out, as Monty Python would say. Okay? There aren't any. No llamas, none of that stuff. No wheeled vehicles, which means you're walking. You want to move anything in Mesoamerica, you're going to walk with it. When the Spanish arrived, the Aztec Empire actually had a very sophisticated, essentially, class of sort of think of them like teamsters. It was a class of people, or a social group, who were trained from childhood. Some estimates are age 5 at the earliest. People started training. They were called tlameme, or to use the plural of the Nahuatl, tlamemeque, tlamemeque. And the tlamemeque were porters who carried burdens using mesh bags or other forms of backpack, but on a tump line around their head and then behind their ears to support weights on their back. You could also move, particularly people, using, there we go, palanquins. Okay? These are usually going to be essentially a square, some kind of wooden square vehicle with posts that you would have then had people carry on their shoulders. That was how you traveled in style. If you were a rich Mesoamerican, you got in your palanquin and some people hoisted you up on their shoulders and they carried you around. That's how you moved in Mesoamerica. And we know they were doing this for a really long time, because this object, which is an example of one of these things, dates to, at the latest, 600. Okay, so there's a long history of the use of these palanquins for transportation. The problem is, pedestrian transportation, which is what we're talking about, is really expensive. Think about moving something like enough corn to feed a town by guys with a bag hung from their head, right? That's not going to get a lot of corn very far. The estimates of how much you could move vary depending on who you ask, and they vary really widely. It's kind of painful, actually, to look at the data because they're double and triple the quantities that other scholars will predict. But what the sort of general acceptance is that a porter could move 50 pounds or 23 kilograms between 21 and 28 kilometers a day, which is 13 to 18 miles. You're talking 15 pounds, on a good day, 15 miles. Of course, if you're doing that in the mountainous parts of Mexico, which is almost everywhere, right, it's going to come down, and you're going to have reduced efficiency in the movement of goods. Now, there is a recent scholar studied Himalayan porters, because this form of transportation is still used in parts of the Himalayas. Himalayan porters can move up to 70 kilograms, which is over, about 150, 160 pounds, over short distances during a day. But we're still talking, you know, if you got a really good adult male porter, 150 pounds, 15 miles, 20 miles. You're not getting a lot of stuff moved that way, which is why for a long time we understood Mesoamerican economic relationships to really be focused on valuables, small, lightweight stuff that one person could carry over long distances and still make a profit. Because remember, you have to feed your porters. And if they're carrying 50 pounds of corn on their back, and it takes them 5 days to get there, how much corn's going to be left? Right? They're going to eat a lot of it. So generally, we presume that the heavy stuff isn't going very far on foot, which leads us, of course, to our second technology, the canoe. Mesoamerican peoples moved goods by water using dugout canoes, period. No other form of transportation, maybe rafts for really big things, but the Spanish didn't document much raft use in Mesoamerica. The dugout canoe is different from other kinds of canoes and other kinds of watercraft that you may be familiar with from the Americas. You have the birch bark canoe of North America. You're going to have plank canoes with asphalt pitch on them in California. Here, you take a tree, you cut it down, you hollow it out, and you shape it to the shape that you want, and then you're done. These kinds of canoes, because we're dealing with tropical environments, these kinds of canoes could get really big because the trees in this part of the world can be very big. For instance, one of the most famous examples, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, Columbus, on his 4th voyage, actually his crew encountered a big ocean-going trading canoe near the Bay Islands of Honduras. So that would be over on the Atlantic side. The estimates are, and it varies depending on whose account from the crew that you read, the estimates are the thing was 8 feet wide at its widest and up to 95 feet long. It was longer than the galleon, I can tell you that much. Of course, it sat much lower in the water, and it was quite a bit narrower because, of course, your dugout canoe can't be much wider than the tree you hew it from. But they got really big. The crew of this canoe was 24 adult men, plus the cargo, plus the wife and children of the owner, the merchant who owned the canoe. So we probably had 30, 35 people on this thing. So these are quite large, impressive vessels. You would have made one of these canoes. Oh, you know, I probably should have explained that last picture, huh? Here we go. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen this before. This is a very famous incised depiction of a canoe being paddled by 2 divinities, one on the far right and one on the left. In the center, the guy going like this is a dead Maya king. These are all sad individuals or creatures. And you can see they're paddling their way into the underworld. This was carved on a rib bone and was found in the Maya area, dates to between 600 and 800. So again, we know that quite a ways back in time, canoes carrying lots of people. I mean, what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, got 7 individuals on this canoe, for instance. Big canoes were recognizably being used quite a ways back in time. Okay, here we go. And I guess technically the parrot and the monkey and the iguana aren't people, but you know what I mean, right? You would have made these things using axes and adzes. These are really common, artifacts like this, and that's a 5 centimeter scale, so that's 15 centimeters. You know, they're usually about this big. They're made of some of the harder stones that we find in Mesoamerica. All those mountains mean lots of great mineral resources. And so stone axes and adzes are very common. and would have been fine for hewing wood for making canoes. The kinds of trees, of course, are a little bit limited. This is an example of a big leaf magnolia. This is today, okay? Not magnolia, mahogany, thank you. Yeah, they got really big magnolias down there in Mexico. You wouldn't know, yeah, exactly, I know. The mess they make when the flowers fall. But you can see that's an adult woman there in the base of the tree. These are big trees. You cut one of those things down and you hollow it out, and you can get a lot of people and a lot of stuff in your canoe. And they're not even that heavy. And they're not light. It's not like a birch bark canoe, okay? But it's a lot. You get 25 people, they can pick it up and carry it to the water. It's not a big deal. There are several species of tree that are actually pretty amenable to this. There's the Spanish cedar, the mahogany. They are resistant to rot. So they do pretty well in the water. Obviously, you know, you have to take care of them and prevent them from drying and wetting and all that. But you can make one of these last quite a while. And certainly in the pre-Columbian era, there were a lot more trees. And they weren't very expensive to make. All you needed was some pretty inexpensive dime a dozen sort of axes and the time to make a canoe. So the capability of making very large water-borne vehicles was widely available. Now, the biggest ones, of course, were going to be in the 50, and if we believe some of the Spanish accounts, 50 to 100-foot range. I think 50 is reasonable for an outside size for these things. You're going to have middle range ones, 8 to 10 meters in length, so you're going to have 20 to 35 or so meters. And then smaller ones as well. The largest canoes, which were used in the Valley of Mexico. You may not know this, but Mexico City used to be right on a big, beautiful chain of lakes. If any of you have been there, you know there are no lakes in Mexico City today. They've all been drained dry. But there used to be a big lake system, and that's how the Aztecs got their food, because they had a couple 100,000 people living on a tiny little island in a lake. And they'd have these large canoes move around the lake and get food from other parts of the valley in which the city was located. The largest canoes were 60-man canoes. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about their capabilities in terms of what they could carry in just a second. Dugout canoes are in use today. I took this photograph 2 years ago. And this is an example of a small one-man dugout canoe. It's in an estuary right near where I work. And we're right at the ocean, and you can see that's a pretty big hill in the background. So there's a lot of vertical topography in this part of the world. I've already intimated the canoe trade was quite old. This is not a great picture. I couldn't find a good drawing of it. This is from the site of Izapa. It probably dates to about 200. And hopefully you can see here in the center, woo, that's a canoe. The guy's sitting on water. You can see the little curly cues of water right here. And there's either a divinity or somebody in the middle of a shamanic transformation or something like that, sitting inside a canoe. So that's a good 1,800 years old. This is a very famous scene from the Temple of the Warriors at Chichen Itza in the Yucatan Peninsula. This is a mural, and again, you can see folks, multiple groups of people, complete with their paddles, paddling, actually getting ready to go to battle. And we actually see a lot of pictures of people fighting in canoes. This is going to date to 800 to 900, something like that. And then this is from a pre-Columbian Mixtec book. It's called the Codex Nuttall. And it was probably painted around 1100, 1200. So again, pre-contact. And this is pretty clear. You can see these guys standing up in their little canoes here, getting ready to do battle, and they're above their conch shell and their birdfish and some alligators. Okay. So these may not necessarily indicate marine movement. Actually, just putting things like conch shells under the water was just to indicate that it was water. It doesn't necessarily tell us that this is an ocean-going event. So we have a long history, at least 1,000 years of documented history, and going back 1,800 years for canoe use in Mesoamerica. Let's talk about what you can move with a canoe. This is from the Codex Mendoza. This is a post-contact document but made by indigenous artists. That guy has rocks in his canoe. And you can see the temple in the background. He's taking the rocks over there to do some repairs to the temple. And our estimates are that some of the biggest canoes could move 15,000 pounds of material on a trip. And the speed of the canoe was pretty consistent, somewhere between 2.5 and 4 kilometers an hour. So you could move quite a ways, 25, 30 miles in a day, kilometers in a day, sorry. And all you had to do was add more people to the canoe, and you could keep that speed up. It wasn't really an issue of weight slowing you down so much as add some more bodies to the canoe, and you can go good distances. A single adult could pull a ton of maize, corn, using a canoe. And 60-man canoes, those really big ones I was talking about, could move 4 tons of maize across the Mexico City lake system in a day. In other words, they were about 40 times more efficient than pedestrian travel. So canoes were a good way to move stuff. And certainly saved you a lot of time and enabled you to do things like move bulk items, which you really couldn't do with a bunch of guys carrying bulk on a tump line. Certainly you can't get a lot of those rocks moved by a pedestrian porter. So what does this tell us about canoe trade on the Pacific coast of Mesoamerica? First of all, those really big canoes went out in the ocean, and we know it because the Spanish saw them out in the ocean on the Caribbean side. And this may be important. I'm hoping we have some mariners here who can inform me a little bit about this. But on the Caribbean side, there are canoes out in the ocean. The canoes are so big, these really big ones, that they can handle the conditions. They're not as wobbly as the small canoes that you and I are used to paddling around here in Florida. The high efficiency of canoes would have definitely have encouraged people to use them, right? Because you could get so much more stuff moved so much more quickly. They're also a really flexible mode of transportation. Think about a canoe compared to a galleon. The draft on a canoe, even one of those big ones, is not going to be much more than a meter, right? And canoes become much more difficult to paddle in open water. So you're going to be encouraged to use those canoes in places like lakes and estuaries. So yeah, you can move a lot of stuff, but do you really want to get out in the open ocean and do it? So this is our one downside to a canoe. All right, so I want to finish up here, because I think I'm doing okay for time, right? Yeah, okay. I want to finish up here by talking about trade routes. We've got stuff to be moved. We've got 2 ways to do it, and we don't have any others. We got our feet and we got our canoes. How are we getting important resources, valuable resources, from point A to point B? Well, let's start with what we know from the time of Spanish contact. The Spanish, when they arrived, went to Mexico City, or Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital. They took over the political system of the Aztec Empire, and they started to move through the empire using existing trade routes on land. Those trade routes aren't really ideal for people who have horses and wheeled vehicles, but they're better than forging completely new roads. The Aztec trade routes, however, were based on Aztec political organization. The Aztecs, despite the impression I think many of us had, and certainly I had when I first started in archaeology, was that the Aztecs that was Mexico, was all the Aztecs. There were in fact several very large areas that were not under Aztec imperial control. One of those is Tututepec, which is marked down here, the area that I mentioned at the beginning. And then you see a couple of other blanked out areas there, the Tlaxcalans and a few other places. And over on the west side of the Aztec Empire, you have a huge, completely independent empire, the Tarascan Empire, that controlled much of the coast to the west of what is today Mexico City. So if the Aztec wanted to get coastal resources inland, they had to work around all the people they were fighting with. And they were fighting with a lot of people on the Pacific coast, including the area around Tututepec. They were actually actively engaged in battles with the Tututepec Empire. The Yopes, which are near, just up from Acapulco, also controlled a big swath of coast. And actually, I think this is I disagree a little with this map. This is from Aztec scholar. This scholar has a little bit more coastline attributed to the Aztecs than I think they really had. But even if the Aztec did control that much coast, you notice the big white spots in between the Pacific coast and the inland areas? Even if the Aztecs were able to get the tribute from the coast, they then had to go through all of this hostile territory to get it to Mexico City. So a lot of trade in the Aztec Empire was focused on this north-south route coming from here, which is where the chocolate comes from. And the map is actually missing a few conquered towns right in here that enabled you to go right up through there to Tenochtitlan. And so when the Spanish arrived, moving Pacific coastal goods around entailed going down to the Soconusco, this area on the far right, and running sort of a northeast-southwest, northwest-southeast line through the center of Mexico. This part of the coast, right here, was completely cut out of that trade when the Spanish arrived. That doesn't mean that in 1100, when the Aztec Empire didn't exist, that this area was cut out of cut out of trade with the inland, right? So we don't really know, certainly not from Spanish records, what would have been going on here 500 years before the Spanish arrived, or 1,000 years before the Spanish arrived. Time periods well within the range of canoe, certainly canoe transport on the Pacific coast of Mesoamerica. In addition, the people who would have lived on this part of the coast, and some of this area over here, many of them were paying tribute to the Tututepec lords and not the Aztec lords. So all the coastal stuff from this area was going to Tututepec. It wasn't going farther inland. And so the Spanish would have disrupted that trade when they arrived in 1522 and changed the entire tribute system to get all this stuff, again, to go back up to Tenochtitlan, which doesn't encourage a lot of movement this way along the coast by canoe. The political situation then matters when we talk about canoe trade prior to the Spanish arrival. One of the things that we do know, at least on terrestrial trade, is that there were a bunch of different smaller trade routes running through southern Mexico. And this map is a little bit hard to read because it's coming out of a GIS program as opposed to Google Earth, which is a little visual, a little more user-friendly visually. Basically, all of these red lines and yellow lines are likely trade routes in the pre-Columbian era that are not necessarily documented by the Spanish. These are based simply on the easiest places to walk if you're a pedestrian in the very mountainous terrain of southern Mexico. The only route that we know the Spanish used extensively is this one, and then this one, right here. But you can see that there are some others. Let's go here. Okay, so let's finish up by talking about what we do know about coastal trade routes. We know for a fact that when the Spanish arrived, there was a Yucatan maritime trade route. It went from down here in Honduras, up around the coast of Belize, up around the Yucatan Peninsula, and then down into what is today one of the largest embayments in Mexico. This trade route is the one that Columbus would have come across when he came through on his fourth voyage. He was somewhere down here when he ran into that big canoe. This was a true maritime trade route outside of bays in open ocean, but again, it's the Caribbean, and my understanding is that the waters are a little easier to navigate. We also know that there was some canoe trade on the Soconusco, this coast, this part of the Isthmus of south of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. This trade route would have brought material, again, here and then led right into Mexico City, which I've already talked about. Here we go. Whoa, what's going on? Oh, I know. Hold on. Ah, there we go. Okay, this trade route was entirely interestuarine. There's a huge system of estuaries. Remember I mentioned those estuaries at the beginning? That run the whole length of the state of Chiapas. They go into Guatemala and south to El Salvador. So what we think was going on is that people were staying inside the estuaries and moving material. And in fact, this trade route was still in use into the 1900s, early 1900s. It's fallen out of use now because people aren't maintaining the openings in the mangroves. And the mangroves have taken over a lot of that water. Which leaves us with the big question. What's happening over here? That's a lot of water and a lot of land, including a huge area with an independent empire here, another independent empire over here, and another big independent empire up there. There's only one Spanish account, I've already mentioned, of any kind of trade by canoe happening in this part of the world. Which leaves us with the question, is it not happening? Did the Spanish simply not talk about it? Or had it already ended and been interrupted by the time the Spanish arrived? Well, unfortunately, I can't answer it for you today. But I can give you my opinion for what it's worth. This is an example of the estuaries on the other side of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. There's that really nice line of estuaries on the east side of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. There's smaller estuaries separated by big stretches, not big, but mid-sized stretches of open ocean on the other side. And also, that really narrow continental shelf. This is great surfing. If anyone here is a surfer, this is where some of the best surfing in Mexico happens. But I don't know that it's great canoeing. So let's step back for a second. I've given you all kinds of information. Here's what I think is going on. I think it's really unlikely that that huge swath of land, many hundreds of kilometers of coastline, are not being used for canoe trade, given the efficiency that canoe provides us. There are 6 big estuaries along the coast of Oaxaca, west of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. So we know we've got great estuaries. Woo. Over here, not so great over here, but there are still some estuary systems. So you could stay out of that really rough surf part of the time. And the estuaries actually get denser as you go north. The densest populations in the Western Hemisphere were right here. All those people needed to eat. They needed honey. They needed feathers for their beautiful clothing. They needed jewelry. They needed copper. And they definitely needed their chocolate. Okay? The only way they're going to get it is from the coasts and from the south. Given how efficient it is to move things by canoe, I would guess, and lots of other people have guessed, I'm not the first person to say this, right? Guessed that there's canoe trade happening over there. So why didn't the Spanish talk about it? Why haven't archaeologists talked about it? Well, I can tell you this much. Archaeologists haven't talked about it because, except for me and about 4 other people, no one does archaeology on this entire stretch of coast. And there's about 5 of us that work in this area. Yeah, a lot of open terrain. That's one reason. And part of the reason we do that, a lot of people don't work there, is because it's about 1,000 degrees a lot of the year. Imagine like the worst summer day in Florida every day with no rain and killer mosquitoes and dengue. Okay, so there are some reasons why people don't work there, okay? Because it's 70 and sunny every day up in the Valley of Mexico, which is inland and lovely. But I think the other reason that we don't hear about it is, first of all, Tehuantepec was closed out of the Aztec trade system, so the Spanish weren't paying attention to coastal trade when they first arrived. Also, a lot of those accounts we have of canoe trade on the Caribbean side come from really early, before the Spanish landed on the mainland. Columbus, we're talking about the earliest trips. That's when we see accounts of a canoe trade. I think by the time the Spanish in 1522 had made it down to Tehuantepec, we were already starting to see interruptions in that trade due to disease. I also think that I know that the Spanish were not actively boating along this coast until 1530. It took them about 7 or 8 years to really get institutionalized boat building and shipbuilding and movement on this coast. And again, by that time, when mariners would have been seeing canoe trade, it had already been lost and interrupted pretty severely. So where do we go from here? What I think we need to do is I think we need to take things like those postulated trade routes, these are terrestrial trade routes, figure out where they might have ended prior to the Aztec Empire's dominion of Mesoamerica, and look for port sites in these areas. I know for a fact that there's a big port, not a big port site, but a site literally on a cliff above the water right there. So it certainly looks, with my sample of 2 sites, right? This one and these sites over here. The people are moving along the coast via water. But until we get some more research done in this part of the world, we can't say for sure. And so I'll leave you with the go out and do some archaeology on the coast of Mexico. How about that? This is a really good question. Were they trading with South America? Those copper axe monies that I showed at the very beginning, that technology was first developed in Ecuador, which is South America. There are a few very serious scholars who truly believe that balsa wood rafts, which were a form of boating technology in South America, had sails in the pre-Columbian era and were used to sail the whole way from Ecuador up to West Mexico, because that's where the other place where those copper axe monies show up. Clearly they're first in Ecuador, then later in time they show up in Mexico. They look almost identical. I mean, it's frightening. They're really essentially the same thing. The technology is very similar. That's a pretty coincidental, I mean, that's a pretty big coincidence. So most people suspect that some kind of long distance trade is happening. The problem is that there's no evidence of pre-Columbian sail use in the entire Western Hemisphere. The very first sighting of a sail took place, I want to say it was 1536. It was Pizarro's second trip to Peru. So the Spanish went down in sailing vessels to Peru, went home, and the next time they went down, they saw sailing vessels, indigenous sailing vessels. So a lot of people think that that sailing technology was picked up by Native Americans seeing sails. So they're talking to each other somehow between South America and Mexico. Is it like groups of people going the whole way up the coast in big long distance trips? I'm really skeptical of that. I think it was some other kind of communication happening. But there are definitely people who think it was going on. What are they doing? What drugs are they doing? There are a bunch. I guess it depends on how you define drug. The Mesoamerican peoples brewed several kinds of alcoholic beverages, much milder than the stuff that we're used to. The kind of stuff that, kind of like Mad Dog, if you know what I'm talking about. It's like this stuff that you'd have to drink a whole, well, Mad Dog may be stronger actually, but you have to drink a whole lot of it, and it's going to make you puke before you get drunk, if that makes sense. There is a toad that lives in parts of Mesoamerica, the bufo toad. The bufo toad is poisonous, but if taken in the right quantities and you're really careful, you can have a hallucinogenic experience with that. So you can lick toad. And, there's also mescaline. No, that's South America. So yeah, there were several. And in fact, drug use was really important, right? Because one of the things you want to do as a Mesoamerican ritual specialist or priest is you need to get inside the shape of another entity, be it an animal, so you serve your animal companion, or you need to talk to something like the sun or the wind or the rain. And to have that conversation, you don't want to do that sober. So, so drug use is really important because that's how you got it to rain. So yeah, absolutely. There was a lot of drug use, generally in very controlled ritual situations. Right, shell middens like the stuff you have, or the mounds like you have here in Florida on the, well, I guess on both sides. To my knowledge, on the Chiapas side, you have huge ones, and they're very, very old, going back to the Archaic period, pre-agricultural, so we're talking 2000 BC, 4,000 years old, on the Chiapas side, where we have those long strings of estuaries. On this side, this group of estuaries doesn't even exist until about 400 BC. This is an open bay. And what happens is, when agriculture develops and becomes extensive upstream, the river starts carrying a lot of sediment as a result of agriculture-induced erosion. And it's not until agriculture becomes established that these estuaries even form. Yeah, this is just the course of the river. I would presume the Verdi is navigable all the way to about, probably to about here. Okay, I would guess there's canoe traffic up the river. What I think is happening, especially with Tututepec, is stuff is coming into the estuary here. You have an open area here. I would guess that they kept open pathways through the estuary here, so you could paddle this whole length. You'd either portage from here to here, or maybe they had a canal. We do have evidence of canal digging in other areas of the Pacific coast. And then you just take the stuff right up here and get it over to Tututepec by land in an easy trip. So I think they were using this river in particular that way. Other rivers, which are steeper, I don't know. And the thing is, we don't know where the site, even where the sites are in some cases.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.